What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
I wasn't their daughter. At least, that's how it always felt. I was the ghost in my own house, moving silently through the rooms while my parents clapped and cheered for my brothers as though they were royalty being paraded through the streets of some kingdom. When my older brother Michael so much as passed a math test, the dining room lit up like Christmas morning, with my mother bragging to anyone who would listen about how her brilliant son was destined for greatness. When my younger brother Daniel scored a goal in soccer, Dad acted as if ESPN should be calling any second to sign him. And then there was me, quiet, steady, doing my homework at the same table, winning small awards at school that barely got a nod, and eventually learning that the less I expected from them, the less it would sting when I got nothing. The favoritism wasn't subtle, it was carved into every family tradition. Birthdays, for example, were a pageant for my brothers. Balloons, cakes shaped like soccer balls or guitars, entire living rooms decorated to match whatever hobby they had that month. My birthday, on the other hand, often slipped past without so much as a candle. I remember one year, Mom handed me a $5 bill in the kitchen while microwaving dinner, mumbling something about being busy with work and not having time for extras right now. $5. Meanwhile, that same year, Michael got a brand new gaming console and Daniel got his first guitar. I kept my face blank, shoved the money in my pocket, and told myself not to care, but the truth was, I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, wondering what I had done wrong to be born on the wrong side of their love. Family dinners were the worst. We'd sit around the table, and my parents would beam while my brothers performed their stories of the day, Daniel's coach telling him he was the best on the field, Michael's teacher predicting a scholarship in his future. My chair was always slightly quieter, my voice a little softer, and the moment I tried to share something about my own life, an essay that won at the district level, a painting that hung in the school hall, I'd watch my mother's eyes flick down to her phone or my father suddenly remember to ask Michael if he'd practiced for his SATs. It was like I was a channel nobody wanted to watch, just background noise they tolerated between commercial breaks. It wasn't just at home, either. Out in public, the charade of family pride revolved entirely around my brothers. Church on Sundays, for example, meant watching Mom beam with pride as she told the congregation about Daniel's goals or Michael's debate victories. My name almost never came up, and when it did, it was usually as an afterthought. Oh, and our daughter is doing fine too. Fine. That was the word they used to summarize my existence, while my brothers were talented, special, gifted. Fine was a band-aid word, a placeholder to keep people from asking questions. The strange part was, I wasn't rebellious. I didn't slam doors, sneak out at night, or bring home bad grades. I was steady. I worked part-time jobs through high school, I stayed out of trouble, and I saved every dollar I could. If anything, I was the one holding the household together in the shadows, doing the chores that went unnoticed, making sure things got done without ever asking for thanks. But instead of appreciation, I got invisibility. I tried to confront them once. It was during my senior year of high school. I had just been accepted into a college I worked my tail off to get into, with a partial scholarship, and I wanted to tell them. That night at dinner, while Mom and Dad were raving about Daniel's upcoming soccer tournament, I cleared my throat and said, I got into Ridgeview. They gave me a scholarship. My heart was pounding as I said it, waiting for a flicker of pride. My mother nodded without looking up from her plate and muttered, That's nice, dear. My father didn't even pause chewing. And then Daniel launched into a story about practice, and just like that, my big moment dissolved into the air. I went upstairs later and stared at the acceptance letter, its black ink and official seal mocking me, because the people I thought would care most couldn't even spare one real smile. That was when something hardened in me. I didn't slam doors, I didn't scream, but I felt something in my chest click into place, like a lock. I realized then that I had spent my entire childhood begging for scraps of affection from people who had already decided I was never going to be worthy of their spotlight. And as much as it hurt, it also gave me clarity. From then on, I stopped volunteering pieces of myself. No more excited stories at dinner. No more waiting for their approval. I poured my energy into work, into my studies, into building a life outside of that suffocating little kingdom where I was only ever the shadow. If they didn't want to see me, fine, I would make myself invisible on purpose. I remember the exact moment it shifted. It was Thanksgiving. Mom had made her usual performance of bragging about Michael's internship and Daniel's new car, and I sat there in silence, pushing mashed potatoes around my plate. No one asked me a thing. When dinner ended, instead of lingering, I stood, thanked them for the meal, and walked out without looking back. I didn't show up for Christmas that year. I didn't answer texts in the family group chat. I faded out, not with a bang, but with silence. At first, they didn't notice. That was the cruelest part. Weeks passed before anyone reached out. But when they finally did, it wasn't the kind of reaching I had always dreamed of. It wasn't a "we miss you" or "we love you." It was an angry voicemail from my father, demanding to know why I was being difficult and hurting the family. And that's when it hit me. My absence wasn't just a quiet rebellion. It was power. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the ghost anymore. I was the silence they couldn't ignore, the missing piece that threw their perfect family picture off balance. So I stopped showing up, and that silence hit louder than any words I could have said. Going no contact did not arrive in a dramatic explosion of shouted truths and slammed doors, but in a carefully measured sequence of decisions that felt almost administrative in their calmness. As if I were closing the books on a fiscal year that had bled too much red ink, because after a lifetime of being told implicitly that my feelings were overhead and my needs were optional, I discovered that silence, when itemized correctly, can become a balance sheet with interest. I started with simple things that nobody notices until they vanish. I left the family group chat without theatrical preamble. I let the predictable holiday messages float into the void unanswered. And I rerouted my mail so there would be no reason for anyone to drop by and pretend it was an accident. Then I turned to the subtler arteries through which a household's convenience flows, and I pinched them shut with the same level of mindfulness you use when you finally unsubscribe from a newsletter that keeps arriving, even though you never remember signing up. What I mean is this. Over the years I had, in the name of being helpful and low maintenance, ended up hosting a hydra of small conveniences on accounts under my name because I had the good credit and the tidy spreadsheets. So the family phone plan sat on my account since college when it was just easier, and the streaming services, the cloud storage, the security system subscription for my parents' house after Dad installed cameras he never learned to use. Even the roadside assistance for 2 cars that I didn't drive, all of it silently charged against a card that I paid off without fanfare because I learned early that attention made things complicated, and complicated made people mean. When I say I went no contact, I also mean I logged in, took a breath, and began the digital equivalent of changing locks. I started with the streaming bundle because it felt like training wheels for courage. I clicked cancel, watched the confetti animation pretend to care about my departure, and pictured my brothers on a Sunday evening trying to fire up a game while a cheery error message told them to check their plan. Then I moved to the cloud storage and reduced their shared folder access to read-only. And not out of spite, but because my archives include my tax documents and my creative work and the private pieces of a life you're allowed to protect when you finally accept that protection is not selfishness. The phone plan took more resolve, so I gave myself a week, and during that week I rehearsed what I would say if anyone called to accuse me of financial betrayal. I practiced phrases like, "I've been carrying this for years, and I'm not carrying it anymore," and "adults pay for their own toys," and when the week ended I separated my line, ported my number, and sent the most polite message I could craft to the family thread that I had momentarily rejoined just to be decent. Please move your numbers to your own accounts within 30 days. Here are step-by-step instructions. I wish you a smooth transition. The backlash arrived with the predictability of a calendar notification. Dad left a voicemail that sounded like a lecture from a high school principal who had found contraband gum. My mother sent a paragraph that started with, "After everything we've done for you," and ended with a pious request that I reconsider for the sake of family unity. And Michael chimed in with a breezy confidence unique to men who have always had a safety net by calling me dramatic and suggesting I chill. While Daniel, who once told me he couldn't afford rent because his creative projects required freedom, asked if I could at least keep his number active until his pilot sold, and in that moment I laughed. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because the absurdity felt like someone had finally opened a window in a room that had smelled stale for years. My revenge, if you want to call it that, arrived wrapped in administrative politeness, which I find more satisfying than fireworks, and it took the form of an email I composed with the kind of clear tone you reserve for human resources. A comprehensive offboarding packet that listed every shared convenience, from the gym family discount where mom liked to take towels home because they wash better, to the wholesale club membership that dad swore he needed for big family dinners, and beside each item I placed a deadline and the relevant link to create their own accounts, and to remove any moral confusion I added a single line that read, "I am not punishing anyone. I am simply returning responsibility to its rightful owners." I pressed send, stepped away from the desk, and felt a surprising lightness that bordered on joy, the sort you get when you declutter a closet and realize you can finally see the floor. The next days unfolded like a silent film in which everyone gestures wildly because no one wants to say the obvious out loud. The gym card stopped working, and there was a comment in the group chat about glitches. The security system app demanded a password reset that only I could authorize, and Dad texted that the camera wasn't loading and could I fix my settings. The streaming tile asked for a payment method, and Daniel posted a screenshot with a laughing emoji that he quickly deleted when no one laughed back, and through it all the message I did not send grew louder than the words they did. I am allowed to stop being your invisible infrastructure. Here is where humor kept me from getting petty, because although I wanted to monologue about adulting, I opted for a single gesture that felt both mischievous and pointed. I mailed my mother the monogrammed casserole dish she had loaned me years ago and never let me forget, cleaned to a near-surgical shine and wrapped with a bow, along with a recipe card that read, "For family dinners you host yourselves, and if that sounds like overkill, understand that it was less about ceramics and more about a message that said, with a wink rather than a slap, I am not carrying this kitchen anymore." I thought the fury would crest and pass, but what rose instead had a different pitch, something brittle and uneasy, because under the outrage I heard a thin thread of worry that didn't match the surface complaint. As if the cancelled conveniences had exposed a deeper dependency no one wanted to admit, and when my father's second voicemail shifted from anger to a strangled civility that asked if we could talk about household logistics, I felt a pinch of curiosity that cut through my resolve. I opened my budgeting app out of habit, scrolled the recurring payments column I kept too tidy for my own good, and as I traced the history of transfers to a family emergency fund I had set up, a fund that had turned into a monthly siphon because grace never ends cleanly when people learn to expect it, I saw numbers that did not align with the story I had been told. And the realization landed with the cold clarity of a ledger settling after years of loose change. It wasn't just my time and patience they had taken for granted, it was the quiet architecture of their lifestyle sitting on foundations I had poured while they told me I was simply fine. And if the ground was starting to shake, it wasn't because I left the group chat. It was because I had finally stopped subsidizing a castle that was never mine. The storm did not come in a single strike of lightning, but in a series of smaller, desperate flashes that revealed just how frantic my parents had become once they realized my absence was not a temporary sulk, but a permanent adjustment to the way I intended to live. They tried everything in the book, and some strategies that felt as though they had written a new edition just for me, and each move reminded me that the people who had once convinced me I was unworthy of attention could, in fact, become obsessed when they feared losing access to the comfort I had quietly provided for years. The first wave came with theatrics disguised as emergencies. My mother called one night, sobbing into the phone that my father had collapsed in the living room and that she did not know if he was breathing. My chest tightened for a moment, that old reflex of duty rising, but when I asked if she had called an ambulance, her answer stumbled, filled with hesitation. And by the time I pieced together her story, I realized my father had simply been napping on the couch with the television blaring. When I chose not to rush over, she accused me the next day of being heartless, of letting my father die alone, though he was very much alive, sipping coffee in the background while she hurled the words. Then came the emotional blackmail, that toxic art form they had perfected over decades of playing their children against one another. My father left a long voicemail where he declared they were rewriting the will, that if I could not be bothered to act like a daughter, then I had no business expecting a cent from them. The irony of it nearly made me laugh, since the only inheritance I had ever craved was recognition, but I knew enough about their finances to understand that this threat was theater. Because they owned little beyond the walls they lived in and the debts they never admitted out loud. Still, they thought the idea of cutting me off would wound me, as if I had been orbiting their approval waiting for scraps, when in truth I had already begun building a world where their opinion no longer determined my worth. But what unsettled me most was not their lies or their threats, it was their need to control the narrative. Suddenly, I was the villain in family gossip, the wayward daughter who had abandoned her aging parents, the selfish girl too proud to forgive. Old family friends would call me, concerned and confused, repeating phrases that sounded rehearsed, as if they had been spoon-fed lines about my cruelty. I realized then that my parents were not just panicked about losing me, they were terrified of losing face, of having to explain why the child they had ignored for decades had finally chosen not to play along. Meanwhile, my brothers continued their lives of excess with a confidence that was baffling given their limited incomes. Michael paraded a new car that should have cost more than his salary allowed, while Daniel posted photos from beach vacations with captions about hard work paying off. I knew enough about their jobs to understand these luxuries did not come from paychecks, and for the first time I began to suspect that the mysterious generosity funding their golden lifestyles had strings that led back to me. The suspicion gnawed at me, so one night I opened my banking app and scrolled through years of transfers and payments, tracing the history like an archaeologist brushing sand from a ruin. I saw the family emergency fund I had established long ago, meant to cover medical bills or home repairs, but the withdrawals were frequent, far larger than any genuine emergency would demand. I saw credit cards linked to accounts that had been handed over to my parents for simplicity, but the charges reflected vacations, electronics, even tuition payments for Daniel's half-hearted attempt at graduate school. And then came the bank notification that turned suspicion into certainty, a reminder of an auto payment for a luxury SUV registered to Michael, drafted directly from an account that bore my name alone. The revelation was not just financial, it was existential. For years they had dismissed me as average, as fine, while secretly siphoning from the very stability I had built with my invisible work ethic. My life of careful budgets and long hours had not only supported me, it had bankrolled their charade of superiority. They had crowned my brothers with luxury, funded by the daughter they barely acknowledged at the dinner table. That night I sat in the dark, staring at the glowing screen of my phone, and I felt a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a strange, sharp amusement. They thought I had cut them off to wound them emotionally, but the truth was far harsher. I had cut off the artery of money that kept their kingdom alive. The desperate calls, the gossip campaigns, the sudden collapse into emergencies all made sense now. It was never just about family unity or a bruised ego. It was about the fact that without me, their golden suns and their comfortable life were built on sand. I decided to let them sweat, to let them taste what it felt like to scramble when the invisible scaffolding they had leaned on for years was finally removed. Yet, even as I felt satisfaction, a darker thought pressed into my mind, one that left me unsettled as I lay awake that night. If they had been willing to drain me silently for so long, what would they do now that the lifeline had been severed? And more dangerously, how far would they go to drag me back into the role they had scripted for me? When I finally stopped staring at the glowing rows of transactions and moved from shock into motion, I did not march into my parents' house with accusations or deliver some cinematic speech about boundaries and debts. Because years in project management had taught me that speeches satisfy pride while checklists change outcomes, so I opened a fresh document, titled it like a quarterly initiative, and began the slow, meticulous work of dismantling the scaffolding they had built from my generosity and my silence. I started with the pieces that had made the siphon possible in the first place, The for emergencies pathways I had established back when Dad's minor surgery turned into a scare, and the hospital forms demanded a single contact with a single card. The temporary concessions that had calcified into entitlement. There were shared logins that felt harmless at the time, an additional card mailed to their address because the bank representative said it would help in a crisis, a family account at the credit union, just to keep things simple, and every one of those choices looked reasonable when each was made in isolation, yet together they formed a quiet irrigation system that watered a garden I did not live in. I met with a banker who had the face of a man who has seen too many families turn love into ledgers, and I watched him nod without judgment as I slid a color-coded folder across the desk, explaining that I needed to revoke authorized users, separate accounts, freeze credit inquiries, and audit the so-called emergency fund whose transactions read less like triage and more like a travel blog. He guided me through the steps with the practiced steadiness of a surgeon, and by mid-afternoon my parents' names had retreated from my financial perimeter like a low tide pulling back from a shoreline, leaving behind the shiny debris of years I could not get back. I called the credit card issuer and removed the extra cards with a calm that surprised me. I reset every password that had ever been typed on a family computer. I changed two-factor authentication to a key fob that lived on my own ring rather than a shared email that pinged on my mother's tablet, and I sent formal letters that used phrases like revocation of access and termination of convenience authorization, because there is a comfort in paperwork that feelings rarely offer. The car, the gleaming, ridiculous SUV that Michael drove as if he had conquered something other than my credit score, required a different kind of strategy, since it was the lone artifact where liability and symbolism intersected. A steel monument to the way my competence had been harvested to fertilize someone else's myth. The loan lived under my name because my rate was better and because, once upon a time, Michael had promised to refinance after a few months. A phrase that now sounded like a lullaby sung to put my vigilance to sleep. I texted him a single long message drafted with the precision of a contract, outlining his options: refinance into his name within 30 days, sell the vehicle and settle the balance, or return it to the lender with me present to negotiate fees. And I added the line that mattered most, the one I practiced aloud until it lost its quiver. If none of the above occurred, I would exercise my ownership rights and remove the car from his possession, not as a stunt but as an end to a liability I no longer consented to carry. He answered with bluster, then with charm, and finally with silence. On day 29, I used the spare key he forgot I kept, drove the SUV to the dealership under a sky that threatened rain, signed the termination paperwork with a pen that felt heavier than it looked, and endured a lump sum penalty that hurt in the short term far less than the long bleed I had allowed for years. I left the key in a small envelope and slid across the counter a neat list of payments I had made to date, indexed like an appendix, because even my revenge likes to be footnoted. I did not taunt him with photos or gloat in the family thread. I simply sent a final, courteous notice that read like the closing paragraph of a business memo: liability resolved, vehicle surrendered, outstanding balance settled, access ended. And as I hit send, I felt the peculiar relief of stepping out of shoes that never fit, but that I wore because they were handed to me with the insistence that a good daughter learns to walk without blisters. While the SUV drama consumed my brother's attention, I did the quieter work that actually unraveled the comfort they had mistaken for destiny. I closed the household credit line my mother had treated like a club membership. I converted the emergency fund into a true escrow that required receipts and a documented cause before any disbursement could be considered. And I installed alerts that chirped like watchful birds whenever a charge larger than groceries attempted to pass through accounts with any historical tie to my name. The streaming services went dark at their house and, without comment, brightened at mine. The cloud storage shrank around their folders until only their own files remained. The security system subscription ceased billing to my card and offered them a polite number to call to become paying customers. And with each severed dependency, I felt less like a traitor to kinship and more like a woman finally refusing to be the unseen infrastructure of an empire that did not list her among its nobles. Still, endings rarely move in straight lines, And the human heart, mine included, does not celebrate a ledger the way it celebrates a sentence that begins with the word finally. So on the night after the dealership visit, I allowed myself a long bath and a longer memory, and I traced the road that brought me here, the internships no one asked about because Michael's fraternity needed a new couch. The side business in analytics I grew during weekends, while Daniel publicly performed at open mics and privately asked me to spot him rent, the cautious investing I taught myself because discipline felt like the only inheritance I was likely to receive, and I acknowledged, with something like tenderness rather than pity. The younger version of me who thought responsible meant invisible and who kept paying the bill because it was easier than enduring the family tantrum that arrived whenever you asked for fairness. That version of me deserved a better teacher than the lesson of silence, and if I had to be that teacher now, then I would be thorough. The next morning they arrived in the expected order, calls from my mother that opened with accusations and pivoted into prayers, a message from my father asking to discuss household logistics, a series of texts from Michael that swung from insult to nostalgia to blame, and a carefully casual ping from Daniel that asked if I had seen the news about a gig he had booked, a gambit for normalcy that felt like a hand slipping into an old pocket. I answered none of them. Instead, I sent one final email to both parents and both brothers with a PDF attached, a tidy audit that listed dates, amounts, access points, and terminations, written in plain English and free of adjectives. And at the bottom, I placed the only line that qualified as theater. Going forward, any request for assistance will be considered case by case and will require transparency, receipts, and a plan not written by me. If you need the part where I sharpen the blade, here it is, because revenge should not only satisfy the audience, but also educate the protagonist. Tucked inside the audit, I included a schedule of recurring donations I had shifted in the last month. Money that once watered a garden of unearned comfort now redirected to scholarships for first-generation students at my state university, to a women's shelter that posts their receipts publicly every quarter, and to a community clinic that quietly covers the deductible for families who would rather skip a checkup than admit they cannot afford one. And while my parents would call this cruel because it meant fewer luxuries for their favored sons, I called it justice with a sense of humor. Because reallocating the spoils of my unpaid labor toward people who never once told me I was merely fine felt like the most elegant registration of a vote I could cast. That evening, just before dusk folded the street into that bluish calm where you can hear your own breath, there was a knock at my door that did not sound tentative or angry, but something stranger, a rhythm of need wrapped in politeness. And when I opened it, my parents stood shoulder to shoulder, dressed as if they were calling on a neighbor, their faces arranged into expressions they believed communicated humility and reason. My mother held a folder and my father held nothing at all, which unsettled me more than a raised voice would have, and after a long pause that felt like the inhalation before a plunge, my mother said the line that almost made me laugh because of its outrageous sincerity and its complete blindness to the past. "We need you to come back. Not for us, for the family. Without you, we may lose the house." They stood on my porch with the expressions of people who had rehearsed humility in the mirror and decided that a soft voice would be more effective than righteous fury. And while a younger version of me would have interpreted the performance as a sign that love was finally arriving on schedule, the woman who opened the door that evening recognized the choreography of need dressed as reconciliation, so I let them in, poured water into glasses they did not touch, and listened while my mother unfolded a file of overdue notices and delicate threats from the mortgage servicer that made a brittle paper sound in the quiet of my living room, then said, with a composure that would have impressed any jury, that without my help they would lose the house. The status, the Sunday appearances, the derived glow that comes from proximity to comfort. My father waited until she ran out of breath, then added, in a voice I remembered from childhood report cards and recitals, that we could get through this. As a family, if I would stop whatever modern independence experiment I had undertaken and restore the system, a phrase that landed with the dull thud of a lid coming down on a pot that had boiled over one time too many. I did not raise my voice or list the transfers by date and amount or recount the holidays where my name was an afterthought, because the ledger had already done that work, so instead I described, in the clean language of project scope, what I was willing to do and what I was no longer willing to be, and I watched their faces like a doctor reads a monitor. I told them I had contacted the servicer that afternoon to confirm that the threats were real and that the timeline could be negotiated if the borrower, not the ghost daughter who made numbers behave, called to request a hardship plan that included income verification and a realistic budget, and I explained that I had no intention of writing a check that would make the next crisis louder, because plugging a hole in a wall you refuse to repair is not kindness. It is theater with invoices. I offered them 2 routes that would keep the roof over their heads without returning me to the role of silent benefactor. The first was a refinance into a modest, fixed-rate mortgage contingent on them closing every credit line that had become a toy, selling the boat they never used except as a prop in photos, and moving my brothers off the family accounts forever. The second was a sale of the house at a price that would clear the debt and leave a cushion for a smaller place that matched their actual income, an option that, while unglamorous, would buy them dignity rather than a countdown. My mother blinked as if I had spoken in a foreign language, then reached for the familiar script where tearful gratitude precedes a request for my card number, and my father tried on authority, reminding me that family solves things in-house. And Michael texted mid-meeting to ask if he could come over to talk like adults, which is what he calls it when he wants to negotiate the terms under which other people do his chores, and Daniel sent a link to a crowdfunding page for a music project that, in a detail I will admit made me laugh in spite of myself, included a tier where donors would receive a handwritten song about resilience. I let their messages land and pass, then slid a sheet of paper across the coffee table with a plan that I had typed in large, simple font so no one could pretend confusion later. I would not pay the arrears, but I would attend a meeting with the servicer if both of my parents signed a written budget that acknowledged real numbers rather than aspirations. I would not cover the lifestyle, but I would pay for 6 months of financial counseling with a reputable nonprofit and schedule the appointments myself so rescheduling could not become a sport. I would not subsidize my brothers, but I would direct them to employment leads I had already compiled that matched their alleged skills, and if they preferred glamour to work, I would not interfere, but I would also not participate in the fallout. Because revenge without a little education feels like empty applause, I added the clause that made my mother's eyebrows lift and my father's lips thin. I had dissolved the family emergency fund and moved the balance into a donor-advised account named for my grandmother, the only person in that house who ever looked me in the eye and saw a full human being. And I had set the first grants to go to the women's shelter and the clinic that quietly covered deductibles, and, in a flourish that I allowed myself because theater can serve justice when applied correctly, I made the gifts in my parents' honor and my brothers' names, which meant the community now believed them to be generous adults and not recipients of my caution. And if they wanted the narrative to remain flattering, they would have to live in a way that did not contradict the plaque on the clinic wall. My mother called it manipulative, then broke, hilariously, into a smile at the idea of people saying nice things about her at church, and my father asked if such accounts could be reversed, and I said, very gently, that generosity is not a boomerang, it is a decision you stand behind even when you discover it is also a mirror. I could see the moment the shape of their need changed, when they understood I would not restore the old arrangement, but had not, as they had feared, slammed the door against every possible future. And in that uneasy space my mother produced an apology that moved like a nervous animal, stopping and starting, then landed on the table between us with the weight of habit, and my father added a sentence about being of a different generation that attempted to turn hierarchy into heritage. I did not absolve them, and I did not humiliate them. I offered them the smallest of doors and told them it did not swing on hinges I would oil forever. If they signed the budget, if they called the servicer, if they worked with the counselor and stopped performing emergencies when an invoice arrived, I would sit at the table once a month and look at the numbers with them like a neutral party whose name did not appear on their accounts, and if they preferred royal fantasy to arithmetic, I would wish them luck from a distance. They left with the paper in my mother's folder and a silence that felt less like punishment than gravity, and I stood in the doorway long after the taillights dissolved, listening to the house make the small nocturnal noises that once meant loneliness and now meant peace earned the slow way. Michael texted again later to accuse me of ruining family vibes, which I chose to read as proof that the vibes had finally met reality, and Daniel sent a wavering apology that might have been genuine or might have been hunger dressed as remorse. And I set the phone face down and let the evening hold its shape without interruption. In the days that followed, I learned more about the elasticity of people than any book ever taught me. Because some mornings my parents called the counselor and asked good questions, and other mornings they rehearsed their old chorus about loyalty and duty and the cosmic unfairness of children who do not behave like piggy banks with opinions. And on the afternoon when the servicer finally scheduled a hardship review, I drove to their house and sat at a kitchen table where birthdays used to vanish. And I watched my mother write numbers that told the truth and my father sign a plan he did not like but could live with if he chose to, and in that moment, as the pen left the paper and the air in the room changed temperature by a degree I could feel on my skin, I realized the story I had wanted my whole life might not end with an embrace or a courtroom speech or a cinematic reveal, but with something quieter and more dangerous, which is the possibility that people can change just enough to keep you guessing. Whether I step through the small door I left open or leave it ajar for the draft to clear the room is a choice I will make again and again, and the truth is I have never felt more powerful or more uncertain, which, if you have ever moved from invisible infrastructure to visible boundaries, you already know is its own kind of happy ending that refuses to tell you if the credits roll now or later.